I think we're working now. Something happened. Who knows? Maybe Nancy bind us or something. So, binding magic. Just like it says on the tin. Binding magic. Yeah? Cool.
You're getting
So,
better at this plugging. You're getting much better at this plugging.
hashtag thothwitchcraft.com. Hashtag thothwitchcraft.com. Yes, that's right. We're live on the Witchcraft Live Facebook group, as well as various other places that we've shoved this. Go and buy stuff from thothwitchcraft.com, such as this magical binding magic tin spell kit. Yay, perfect. Right, there's the plug-in. So what we've got to talk about is the binding magic. So, kind of a little bit of an umbrella term, binding magic. I mean, it does say on the Thoth Witchcraft binding magic spell kit, I bind you, Nancy. I bind you, Nancy. Do you see that? I bind you, Nancy, from doing harm to yourself and other people. So, Chris, what's a binding magic?
As if you can ask me that. Okay. And binding magic is anything that restricts or binds. There you go. Do you need any more than that?
I mean, come on now. You can do better than that, surely.
So yeah, but no. Essentially, it is any kind of magic that restricts an effect or a person or a thing. The sorts of stuff we would kind of probably use it more for is restricting the influences of certain spirits or allowing a certain allowance of energy, but having a stopper. So anything where you want to either stop an energy level going too high is one thing I would often use it for, or actually dropping too low, etc. So anywhere that you want to control an output or an input. Is that more of your liking?
That sounds like volume control now, Chris.
Yeah.
So I think stereotypically, when people think of binding and binding magic, much like why on the tin it got the handcuffs and the rope, is they're talking about stopping someone. So like in that Craft film, was it The Craft? I bind you, Nancy. Stopping someone's magical power, so stopping someone. So I think stereotypically, when you certainly see like binding magic used on the television and on the sci-fi and that, it's a case of removing someone's magical power or stopping them from affecting or using magic on a situation. Now, it's not all that though, is it? Because people will use binding magic to stop things such as habits. So, for example, if you had a smoking habit and you wanted to stop yourself from smoking, some people will do a binding spell on themselves to stop that craving, to stop them. So how that might manifest could be controlling the cravings, but it could also be that, well, every time I go and ask someone for a cigarette, they either haven't got one or they say no, or the lighter doesn't physically work, all those kind of things. So binding magic isn't just a case of like a straitjacket or handcuffs. It can manifest in other ways, but it's essentially kind of saturnine, isn't it? It's this limitation. It's putting a strict limitation on something. Whether you're limiting a person from doing anything, putting someone in a coma can be quite a good binding. Technically, people wouldn't associate putting someone in a coma as binding magic, but if you think about it, they're trapped within their body
for a specific amount of time.
If you wanted an extreme binding, there's such a thing called locked-in syndrome. You can look it up. Not very nice.
Not very nice at all.
Considered nice magic, would probably be considered baneful magic. But difficult, because would you class that as a binding or would you class that as a curse? Well, some of these words and things kind of come together, But in terms of your stereotypical binding then, if someone was to buy the binding magic kit, a mundane, for example, or a beginner witch, what's the sort of things that they're normally interested in using binding magic for?
Well, most people will go stereotypically, if you that's where you want me to go, is going to a kind of protection work.
Mm,
So it's normally at keeping someone from harm, um, or stopping them, like Nancy, from doing harm. So those are normally the two you get. It's either a protection of somebody, or it's actually normally designed to stop someone having a negative effect.
mm,
So those are the two you most commonly get with. So some people will use a binding in the protection line, for giving a restriction, and that's the word I would keep using whenever. I mean, is a restrictive zone of nothing negative passes this boundary. So some protection magics are designed on that, such as kind of home protection ones. They're often normally used with a they're normally used with herbs that you find in the cupboard. So I
mm,
find protective kind of protective bottles, kind of magic, bottle, are kind of basil or oregano, that there are these kind of garden herbs that distinctly say home. So they're normally foods that you use in cooking. So they're normally ingredients you use in cooking. So they normally have salt, or like I say, herbs like basil, or oregano, or those sorts of things that have this kind of protective. If you friend, Scott Cunningham, would obviously list all these ones under the protective herbs category.
mm,
Um, but the reason that they are under that category is because they are safe for consumption. Is
mm.
the main reason that they actually hit that list. I don't know if any of you have actually thought about that, but that's the reason that they are on there are so many on the protective list. It's because these are all herbs that are safe for you to eat normally. Um, if you're going down the Scott Cunningham route. But yeah, so that's the one type, and then obviously the other end is binding some protection magic in binding someone negative from doing harm.
Mm.
I bind you, Nancy, from doing harm against yourself and harm against other people. Is the correct quote, Liam? There you go. Your
Okay,
turn.
I'm not that great with me pop witchcraft, but I do try. I mean, I did put it on the tin,
You
binding
did. You
Nancy. I
did
got
put.
it F right, didn't I?
You got it
Um,
off right.
so okay, so binding magic. We're familiar with this thing that people cock up all the time, don't they? Where they get the person's name, they shove it in an old ice cream container, fill it with the water, and stick it in the freezer to freeze their influence. It's a
Oh,
freezing
those
spell.
freezing spells.
That's a type of binding spell because you're freezing their influence on you. So that specific thing is a case of a consecrating that name label. So getting a pen and a post-it note and writing the name of the person and projecting their energy into that, and then symbolically freezing it in ice and leaving it in the freezer means that it's freezing their influence. Of course, what a lot of the books forget to tell you is what to do after that. So we've had how many countless people in it that have said
I don't want
they've,
to give a number
they've
to it.
taken
It's
us aside
disgusting.
at a psychic fair or something and said, "I got this thing in the freezer and I'm scared to take it out." And we always say, "Have you put someone in the freezer to bind them or to freeze their influence?" And they're like, "Well, yeah, but I don't know what to do now because they're long gone and I'm scared to take it out the bloody freezer." And we always
Okay,
say,
so come back.
take it out the fucking freezer. At the end of the day, if you're getting rid of that, here's a little trick. Get rid of it, get rid of it far away. What I like to do, if I was to do that, is take that little Tupperware container or that container with the ice and go and throw it in a river or something that flows away. As it melts down, it'll wash away into the wider world, away from me. You could
Or
go and
flush it
leave
down
it
the
somewhere
toilet.
else to melt. The point is not to leave it in your house or near you because otherwise that's going to be melting into your land, into your area. So that's a super simple one. but it's symbolic, and you can kind of see the idea of freezing someone's influence, freezing the name of that person. The person is the name, all of that sort of crap. Um, but it gets a little bit more complicated, doesn't it? Because you could use something like that if you didn't have someone say you worked with, and you didn't like them, then you might freeze their influence on you. Or maybe you are a person who is has an enemy and they keep working against you, you might freeze their influence. It gets a little bit more complicated when things get more serious. So if there's a predatory person, for example, so we might be talking domestic abuse or something like that, then that might be more serious, and it might require more energy and power to be put behind that than just sticking them in the freezer and binding the influence. Because that's the difference. The difference here is you've got someone that's affecting you. If you've got a colleague or someone you work with that makes snipey comments and that's really just is just an asshole, right? There's a difference between there being an asshole around that you're near and therefore is making your own life nasty. There's a difference between that and there being a predatory person that's trying to prey on you or someone specific, because they're going out of their way to really do nasty things and be a nasty person and prey on that person. So that requires a stronger force. So when you get those sorts of things, much like with the binding kits that we sell and the stereotypical bindings that you tend to see, they normally recommend getting and making a poppet or something like that of the person, and then binding that poppet with a string or a yarn or something, because you're consecrating that and you're tying it, and every time you put a knot in, you just continually knot it time and time again, put more and more and more string until it has an effect. So that's quite a popular one, because you're talking, I think, with beginners, is they struggle to get everything right first time. So these ideas of candle magic and single use spells, where you bless and anoint a candle, and then you burn the candle, you charged it, and then it releases and goes about doing its business. If you don't get that right first time round, your spell didn't work. But when it comes to ongoing things, which is why a lot of the time people use the poppets for it, is that you're working on it continuously. So you might start that at the beginning of the week on the Monday. So say this was someone that was being not particularly nice to someone that you work with, and you decide, okay, this person's a bit of a sexual deviant or something like that. You don't want to complain, because it's not your place to complain, and you're worried about things like that happening and having to come forward and stuff. You just want this person to not affect the person that you're working with, so a friend or something like that. Then what you would do is you might start consecrating, start working on the puppet of this nasty person called Fred. Let's say his name's a Fred. It's not a name in really Fred, it's John, because I've done this before. His name's Fred. You start on the Monday, you start consecrating and tying. Now, there's a certain amount, because of course, where our attention goes, energy flows. There's a certain amount of energy you're projecting into that work on the Monday when you start tying the knot. Now, this has a cumulative effect. If you do it on the Monday, and then you do it on the Tuesday, and then the Wednesday, and then the Thursday, all of a sudden, you've kind of got 7 in one, haven't you, Chris? You're working on it. Is that the reason why you kind of do this with mundanes as well, or beginners, this kind of work?
Well, it's where these kind of 9-knot spell kind of traditional methods in kind of knot magic come from, are where you are repeating a process, and each time you repeat the process, you're putting more energy.
You're building.
You're building a building until a kind of climax. So normally, I personally would set the amount of days before you start, and then obviously that way you know that the end point that you are working towards, like a peak of that, or it's a case of, well, actually, when do you know to stop otherwise? So unless you're, because when you do this kind of work, you don't necessarily have eyes on the target. So if, particularly if it's someone at work, you might see them once every couple of weeks. If it's not someone that directly affects you. I kind of want to jump back a little bit before I forget. And kind of what you were saying before, people tend to forget when it comes to dealing with psychic vampires and those of a predatory nature. People forget that the main reason you don't use single-use spells is not so much because they might not work, is that if you've just fired energy at somebody non-specific, and their job in life is to absorb energy, that's not necessarily helpful. Also,
You fed the wild dog. That
you fed the
predatory,
wild
that
dog.
psychic vampire, that wild dog. You basically just fed it.
You're feeding it. The other reason for not doing it with single-use spells is if that is a single-use spell doesn't have enough power, you're giving that person a slight reprieve. But sometimes when a dog has been denied what it wants to eat, it's ravenous by the time that energy barrier runs out. So what people tend to forget, particularly when it comes to, psychic vampires, predatory people, that yes, you may have given that person a little bit of relief. Now that's fine if it's one of those things where you want to break a cycle, in which case you might just need to give that person enough of a break that it clicks into their brain and they leave of their own accord. That's about the only time that it is acceptable to use a single-use spell on a process and a situation like that. The problem you have is, like I said, if that isn't a large enough break to break the cycle, all you've done is starve a hungry dog for several days, and you think that that's going to be a good thing to do when that spell runs out and that person's still in that situation. So if you're in that kind of predatory relationship, domestic setting, a single-use spell is definitely not the way to go. If you're trying to do a binding, because obviously that's the problem you've got, is you're giving that slight reprieve, but think of it from the other side, which is, how does this person feed? I know that's a strange word for people to be used to hearing, but these, those sorts of people are psychic vampires. They feed on a certain kind of reaction, a certain kind of energy, and the second that supply stops, you're not necessarily cutting that person to go and try and find another use or another source. What you're potentially doing is just starving them, even though the source is right in eyesight. So, you tease a dog the other side of the railings for long enough, eventually the second you've got a finger over there, that finger and the rest of the hand is probably going to go. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of get that bit in while I thought about it, because otherwise we get to the end and I'll have forgot.
Okay, so if we go for some examples and go up in terms of severity. So if we wanted to bind a mundane person, right? So your mundane person is your person which you might work with in the office, is someone with no magical ability or aptitude. They're just an everyday person at the end of the day, and you're wanting to bind them from affecting you. So say they might pick on you, or they might mess about with your work or something like that. Either way, they're affecting you and your work. What might be a simple one to go for with that kind of a thing? I mean, we've listed the abracadabra spell as one of those kind of things, which you can get. If you don't know what the abracadabra spell is, you need to go on the Thoth TV YouTube channel and have a little look at that. But that's quite a common one that people use. Or that kind of freezer spell that we talked about earlier. But there we go. So the mundane person. Any other ways to kind of tackle that if you yourself aren't particularly experienced?
You can do basic not spells. So not necessarily I just realised how bad that sounds. Not necessarily a a convoluted one, but literally a cord with a tag on the end with that person's name, or tie the knot around the person's name, one or the other. Those kind of basic, kind of just once, kind of very basic. The other one was obviously what happens in the craft, which is a photograph of the person and wrapping a cord around it or a ribbon around it while incanting, saying, because that's kind of what they're getting at in the craft, is this is very basic magic for who they were trying to bind. But if you want to go from a sympathetic point of view, a photograph, a little drawing or their name, and then binding that in some way. So the freezer, or like I said, literally wrapping a cord or about it. Some people do try the other method, which is they don't use cards at all, and all they do is they write the word bind over and over again over the person's face or
So if you've got
over
a
the name
picture of their Facebook
until you can't see
profile,
them.
you could print that out and write that over. The point is really because there's a mundane person, they have no recourse, they have no ability themselves to do magic, or they haven't discovered that they do yet anyway. So they're not going to be able to deal with that. So you sending anything, any sort of magical restriction towards them and aiming it at them, they're not really going to be able to avoid that. And really what you're talking
or
about
notice
is
it.
Yeah, something symbolic really is what you're doing. So all of the things that Chris, you kind of just mentioned is symbolic, representational magic, and is the fact that you're focusing, and as you're doing that, as you're writing the name, as you're writing bind, as you're tying the knots around the picture in a scroll, what have you, you're putting energy into that. You're using your own energy to feed through that to go to them. Now, things get a little bit more complicated when we go on to people that can affect or absorb that energy or send it back. So the next kind of situation that you're talking about is a psychic vampire. So with psychic vampires, you're talking about people that absorb energy naturally, but you're also talking about those kind of personality profiles. Is it the narcissist, the sociopath, or the psychopath? Those sorts of people essentially can be quite predatory. So you have to take a slightly different approach. Also, like you said, Chris, basically, these people might be mundanes, they might not have magical aptitude, but what they will have is they'll have the natural kind of physiology, energetic physiology, whatever you want to call it,
and an appetite that needs
they
feeding.
naturally absorb energy and manipulate energy. Now, they don't do it to any form of an advanced standard, so they're not kind of like a witch or a magical practitioner, but if you send energy towards them, much like you send any energy towards a narcissist, they absorb it and they feed off of it. So doing your standard kind of work where you're just willy-nilly adding energy to something that you're projecting, that you are feeding that person at the end of the day. So in terms of psychic vampires, and sociopaths and psychopaths and all those kind of those types of people that do have an ability to kind of manipulate energy and absorb it to a certain extent, but also more importantly, I think vampires, why we call them psychic vampires, because they need to take. So you're talking sort of if someone's in a relationship with someone, so say you have a friend that's in an abusive relationship, there's some sort of domestic violence situation going on. Well, you might not want to do a magical murder or some sort of hex or curse. What you might want to do is bind that predator, that predatory partner, from causing harm and feeding on your friend. So in terms of those kind of approaches, what would you kind of recommend, Chris, for that? Because that's, again, if we're talking kind of beginner witches or mundane people that haven't got a huge amount of experience with this sort of thing.
Well, I think we could go back to your poppet and the binding over the space of a week. You could use something like that if you feel capable. Our Fred. And in that kind of process, you don't necessarily, like we've said, you've got two routes. You either go down the biologicals route, and you find, if you can get hold of something, obviously, if this isn't somebody that you regularly work with, or you're trying to protect somebody else from them, that might not necessarily be an option. What you then can do is stuff it with everybody can get hold of a Facebook to a photograph, a profile picture, sorry. Can get those or anything like that, that just, if it depends on what you need to visualize. So that's the important bit when it comes down to pop-it work, is how much do you need to visualize. So if you can instantly connect to that doll and know, and definitely know that can happen, is that what it comes down to. So if you need the visual representations, so I'll just quickly say, Lisa, yes, it'll be on Soft TV, and it stays on Witchcraft Live if you need it to. So
Right.
Lisa
That's
asked
all right.
if
Was that a
we
question? Was
will
it?
watch this later.
Will I be able to watch later?
So yeah, and we also upload these to Soft TV now every month, so they're on the YouTube if you need to refer back to this later. But yeah, sorry, to get back to my point. So you have the issue of whether or not it needs to how you need to interact with it. That's what it comes down to. So if you need to visualize, then maybe cutting out a Facebook picture of them and sticking that on where the head is on the doll is what it requires, then that's what you do. If it is somebody that it is a loved one or someone that intimately, that's where you can go down to the point of drawing on their tattoos or anything like that that symbolizes that link, without that necessarily being a recognizable item. So if you were a random person open that box, you wouldn't know that mole on their butt cheek has always been there, but you do. So it allows you to be more covert. Depending on what you need to, it doesn't need to be on the outside. If you're comfortable with knowing that connection with that, it could just be what you stuff it with. So a sock, or bits of just the words, just that person's name over and over again on bits of paper could be the stuffing. Like, there are lots of ways to do that. That's one way. I would probably, my favorite method for dealing with psychic vampires, and Liam will know exactly what I'm about to say, is mirror boxes. So mirror boxes are my favorite way to deal with a psychic vampire. And the reason for that is, one, it has that beautiful poetic license of vampires not being seen in mirrors. Like, I can't help it. Like, my name's Christopher Lee at the end of the day, like, the original Dracula. So I can't not love the irony that goes into that. But yeah, I like mirror boxes because, one, it is a restriction, it is a binding, because the mirrors on the inside of the box, not the outside of the box, are designed to focus the energy in. The reason they work so particularly well with psychic vampires is because mirrors are designed to make you see what you don't like seeing. And the whole point of that is, when you surround somebody that is entirely reliant on absorbing energy from somebody else, where only thing they get to look at is themselves, even for a narcissist, is too much. They can't see every flaw of them mirrored back at them constantly. So, it will start to break down even the most horrible narcissist will be broke down by a mirror box if it's done in the right way.
And if you don't have a box which has mirrors in it, you can literally transform a simple container. Like, this is the Binding Magic kit that we sell, but it is a tin box, so it is kind of mirrored at the end of the day. But if you have your puppet and you just had a little wooden box or a cardboard box, if you lined it with tin foil, that's essentially a mirror, and then you put him or her or them in that, and then you put that in, that's one of those things that is still going to work, is still essentially going to work the same way. Now, because we are talking about psychic vampires and predatory kind of people, specifically with this example as a predatory partner, and because we've done quite a lot of work with people or for people that have had that problem, the one important thing that I would say, if you're a beginner, inexperienced, or are a mundane and aren't used to magical practice, this is not a one-stop trick. This is not a fix-all, okay? Now, what you're talking about, if we liken it to something else, if you've got an alcohol problem, removing alcohol from your house is not going to stop you from being an alcoholic. It's one part of a multi-stage plan. If you've got someone that is suffering with domestic abuse, say you have a friend that has a partner who's a predator and is abusing them, binding that predatory person is going to help, but it's not the full prescription, essentially, that we would say. Because what you have to take into account is that you have to take into account that that person has that personality where they are feeding on things. So if it is a psychic vampire or a sociopath or a psychopath, this is their natural state. This is who they are. This isn't someone that's going through a rough time and lashing out at people that you might want to do a temporary binding on. This is someone that has that psychology. So what you would want to do is you would want to bind them and to stop them from interfering, but you'd also want to send them away. You'd want to take the partner that is being abused, get them out of that situation, and keep that other person pushed back, pushed away, which can be a little bit more complicated than just a simple binding. So that's an important thing to remember. More extreme cases and complex cases doesn't necessarily mean that you can't do it yourself, but you have to start thinking about all the factors that are at play. And remember that you're talking about the psychology of the target as much as the approach, and it should mirror that. So if you've got a predatory person, they are a predator, they need to constantly feed. Having that person or any person in their vicinity, they will feed on whatever is in their way. So yes, a binding can work to keep them away, but remember, it's going to be like a rabid dog. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse. So if you've got an energetic binding or a binding spell, the output of your spell, the magic, the force behind that is going to need to be stepped up and up and up in order to keep them pushed away. Now, manifestations, if you put a lot of energy into a binding, for example, if I bought a binding kit or I did a binding with a poppet or something, that could manifest if I put enough energy in to have that predator locked up behind bars and put in prison. If I don't have enough energy put behind that, then it will start to work, but it may just mean that, well, they keep getting a flat tire and can't make it home to that partner they're abusing. Or, you know, something happens and they can't quite be there, or things kind of, you know, you've got to think about, when it comes to designing spell work, energy that you're putting into it and what output that has. If I put 2 AAA batteries into something that's designed to be plugged into the wall, it's not going to work. So it might flicker a little bit and come on for a second, but it's not really going to work. So when it comes to the energy, the power sources, I think that leads us nicely into the next one, which is essentially, of course, the complicated one, which is why we're going to have to spend the longest time on it, which is, how would you go about binding a witch? You know, so to bind a witch, because that's a magical practitioner that not only can take the energy, can manipulate it and send it back. So is it a case of like a tennis match overpowering, or what are your thoughts on that, Chris?
It can be, but that really depends on your approach. So for me, binding another witch, not that I ever really do it.
You just kill them off, don't you?
Well, yeah, you either kill them off or you make sure that you're that's how do we put it? That you are so appealed off as such a threat that they wouldn't come for you anyway. Is so making sure that yeah, you've got that much of a fortress that people kind of go, I'm not sure I'm going to try a 10-year siege on that. Anyway, there is so if we go to the basics, I personally would for someone that is kind of new to witchcraft would probably go with the next step up of a poppet. So not necessarily something that is made of cloth, but actually making something slightly more solid. So the ancient Greeks would have used lead. I don't suggest that you go and do that. Um, but there are methods of doing it that it was making something that is permanent because
Mm.
this isn't something you're going to want to necessarily undo. This is something you're going to want to keep permanently. Because again, going back to the rabid dog or the caged animal, is the second that's let out in this situation, it's going to be coming back for you.
Mm.
So the question is, first of all, are you wanting to bind them because you don't want them influencing you? That is
Mm.
a very different kind of spell work. That is essentially a protection or a warding problem that you could have fixed. Or are you actually saying that you don't think this person should be doing anything? And that's why I say binding witches is not something I do very often, because obviously it's much easier to end this cycle for them and send them over to the abyss for a little while until they learn better manners. But you've got that kind of, is it down to you are wanting to stop them doing certain kinds of work or all kinds of work? All of these are parts that you need to consider when you're dealing with someone that has the know-how and the ability to fight back. So this is where you all have to, consider what's what. Um, you know, liken it to the alcoholic thing again. Are you trying to take all alcohol away from them so that it can't imbibe it anywhere, so that literally every time alcohol touches their lips, they throw it instantly back up into the point that they can't possibly enjoy it? Or are you binding them from never seeing it again? So the fact is, they could be stood in a chocolate shop and it looked like an empty room. Like, is how are you actually wanting this to manifest?
Mm.
And then going back to what you use. So for me, I would probably make one out of clay, something more permanent, which I know is traditionally used for healing practices. But what I like about clay is it can be worked the same way it can with like dough, of that kind of, I'll get to the dough part in a minute. But with the clay part is because it's a mixed ingredient that sets, means you can put all sorts of things in it. The same with if you were to make a wax doll, I guess. With the wax, at least, there are more opportunities for it to melt and therefore ruin the spell work you've had designed. You want something more permanent. So the thing I like about clay is because you can stuff it full of magical incense and all sorts of things before you set it. Um, that can add into the magical working that you're doing.
Mm.
Also, unlike dough, um, anything you inscribe in it is set. So I like that you go and cook it and it's done. So
Mm.
which you can do with salt dough. Salt dough is another way of doing that. Is where because it sets rock hard. But obviously you don't have that clear lines that I love about clay, where you can, inscribe these beautiful things all over it, and they're stuck forever. The only way I would use a bread dough if you're doing those kind of things is if you are considering something that you want to waste away. So the nice thing about using a bread dough or something like that is, again, you can put all these herbs in. But if you're wanting someone's power to wither away as well as bind, then obviously you have the options that it is biodegradable, it can go onto the compost heap, and it can be worn away. Is there a reason you've disappeared, Liam?
No, I'm here.
Okay.
I had to
So
get
yeah,
something.
oh, okay. There is that kind of opportunity there with a more bread dough kind of style. If you're wanting to not just bind, but
Mm,
have their energy source wither away until the point that they can't use magic at all, that's when you start to connect yourself with something that could die off or rot away.
mm. So one of our patrons from the Thoth Witchcraft Patreon, I was speaking to earlier today. If you want mentorship from us and us to teach you in the magical arts and stuff, join the Thoth Witchcraft Patreon, you people. There's all sorts of interesting stuff in there that we cannot talk about on here. So
Yeah.
our friend, little Delphi,
Mhm.
she's binding a witch at the moment. So she's got a magical enemy who happens to be a witch. And that witch is a working magic against her. She's a fairly low level witch, but still, they can be a bit of a nuisance, can't they? You know. So she's come up with what we're calling the triple binding cloche spell. So, like
Gosh.
you like the, yeah, cloche. Cloche is in a cloche that you put on a plate in
Oh,
a
okay.
fancy restaurant and stuff.
Okay.
So the triple binding cloche spell has three parts to it, hence why it's a triple spell. So what we've got is, like you said about clay puppets, she's essentially
Mhm.
using a plasticine puppet of the witch that she's
That works.
consecrated. And she's binding it with the ribbon. She's got some black ribbon, so she's binding it with the ribbon. That's the kind of that's the actual basic binding, but
Mhm.
which is what a lot of people would do from a mundane perspective in doing mundane work, if they tend to do that sort of thing. Now she's got some extra steps in place because what she's decided to do is she's got a mirror and she's got a glass cloche. So she's standing the figure of the banged witch on the mirror in the cloche. So that's a secondary layer of defense and to stop. So any energy that the witch does manage to break through, that first binding, there is a secondary binding to stop that. Now, obviously,
Mhm.
free triangles and such, the triple binding spell would not be complete without a third tier. So the interesting thing about what she's chosen for the third tier is she's actually to try to start getting other energies such as plant allies and such involved in this. So what she's got is she's selected a couple of other ingredients. I'm not going to go through the whole list of ingredients, but there's things such as a tiger's eye crystal, um, there's things such as a little bit of a lavender, all stuff that she uses a lot and has a strong connection with, and that is loyal to her. So the plant spirits and the spirits within those things are inside that cloche. So what that does is essentially, because a lot of the time with the mirror boxes and stuff like that, what you tend to find is if that person, that witch that you're targeting, builds up the power and projects that out, it's going to rebound back to them. The problem with that is that they're aware that someone's working against them. So, you know, the jig is kind of up. They know that that spell has gone off and then been sent back. They know that someone, their target, whoever is working magic against them. The nice thing about this spell that she's designed is that the energy that is emitted, it is banged. So the nasty witch in question, the target, is banged, but any energy that comes out of that is directed towards those plant allies within that kind of force field, which is the cloche. So they absorb that. But the purpose of them being there is to defend the witch. So essentially, if you think of these plant allies as the guard dogs of our witch friend, she's set up little guard dogs that feed off the energy that is being sent out by the bad witch towards our good friend witch. And they're eating up that energy and then going to use that and attack the witch if she breaks through her binding. So you've got that kind of free triple threat, which is might be a bit complicated, but the more powerful your opponent is, of course, the more extra things that you've got to put on. Now, you could use that type of magic on a mundane, yeah, and that would work beautifully. But with a witch, the first couple of instances that we tried, our witch friend from the Patreon is assuming that actually that evil witch that's working against her, she does a standard binding, the witch is going to be able to break through that. So there needs to be an extra layer or two of defenses to stop that. You're, like in chess, you're 3 steps ahead of your opponent. Of course, ultimately, if she does break out of the binding, she's going to get a little surprise in this form of all of the energy that she sent out is not only going to be eaten by a bunch of spirits, but those spirits are going to come looking for more food. So the last one that I want to cover, because we've only got 15 minutes left of the time's flying, is binding spirits. Because how do you bind something that doesn't have a physical body? Because that's an interesting one. I mean, I've got my little book, my prison book back here with a couple of spirits are bound in. But let's talk about kind of the theory and practice of binding spirits and how that kind of works, and when you might even want to try doing that.
Oh, I thought you were going to start.
Well, I can go off and on and on and on and on, so I better shut up.
That's fine. That's fine. Right. The simplest way to put it, and it's probably going to sound too much like the ceremonial magician's way of thinking about the world. However, when it comes to binding spirits, it becomes a test of wills. So who has the most power? So that's what it will come down to. So can you raise and manifest and manage enough power in order to restrict something that is without a body? So the obvious ones and the sorts of things that are stuck in the pages of that book over there are kind of what we would consider to be lower level spirits. So leftovers from a physical form, so ghosties and all the other kinds of spirits that are used to having a physical body. So outside of one are not necessarily as powerful as they were within one, give or take. I'm
Maybe the odd
generalising here.
goetic spirit might also be in there, but we don't talk about that.
No, but again, with the goetics, you are starting to deal with spirits that are bound to certain sets of rules, and being able to bind them into a book is not outside of the realms of what is normally done to them. They're still, to a large extent, most goetic spirits are still within that kind of earthly energy. Do you see how I avoided the word lower just on that occasion? But because people will get shitty with me, are earthly bound spirits. So that we can cover at a greater depth later on in the year. But yeah, so most people consider those. So those are the two kinds of spirits they're trying to bind. Those, again, like I say, are both closer to Earth, closer to this realm, which allows them to be bound quite simply, with a good enough spell and a good enough containment module, like that that book behind him. It is that combination of, do you have enough vessel to hold what you're actually trying to bind, or where are you trying to bind it to? Then you get to other levels, which start to become the kind of super witch stuff you're used to us talking to you about on No Holds Barred, if you follow on there, which is creating astral realms or other worlds in order to house greater spirits, shall we say. Starts to get a bit more messy. But it comes down to, in its basic principles, that you have a strong enough containment, you have a strong enough energy to submit them, and that the third part is, like you say, with Little Delph, is a great containment field if they manage to get out. So what are your fail safes for holding a binding like that. You know, the Bible and those particular types of spirits have a set of rules that they will apply to. That is the perfect vessel to hold a goetic spirit and anything else earthbound that might not have the energy to fight back. A Bible is a good place to go. You know, do we need to explain why that is? I suppose you could a little
I
bit.
think we could probably do an entire episode on that, actually, because that's a
Yeah, I think
fascinating
we should.
subject in
That'd be
itself.
good. That'd be good.
But why don't you explain? Because I think you banged an archangel once and stuck him in a cupboard or something. So can you explain the thought process behind when you banged an archangel?
I
Maybe
don't
which
think
one it
that's.
was.
I don't think this is a good place to do that.
No, but it's
Personally,
Ask a Witch, and I'm asking.
oh,
I don't get
okay.
to ask the questions, guys. But this is a Q&A. So if you ask Chris how he banged an archangel and which archangel it was and stuck it in a cupboard, I think technically, according to the rules, he has to answer.
Yeah,
So
I
someone
just
will
don't.
write it in the comments quick before
I
we
just
go in
don't.
10
I don't
minutes.
see why that kind of witchcraft is really suitable for Witchcraft Live myself.
Why is that?
Well,
Is it
because
because it's intermediate?
it's super witch bollocks that you.
Okay. So it's
Yeah.
intermediate stuff, so it's not suitable
Well,
for
I'd
Witchcraft Live.
basically have to spend. I'd have to spend. Of course, of
There we
course.
go.
I did it.
We've
There you
got our
go.
question. How did you bind an archangel, Chris? So, Chris, how can you
Oh,
bind
look.
an archangel? Can you please tell us more about binding an archangel? Was it Michael? Was it a
Yes, it was.
Michael? It was, wasn't
Yes, it
it?
was Michael.
But
It
Chris,
was
I thought
Michael.
Archangel Michael was the most powerful being in the universe. He works for that Yahweh thing, doesn't he? How can you, a lowly witch, bind him and stick him in a cupboard?
Well, one, that goes on the basis that you assume I'm a lowly witch. But there you go. That's the most super witch thing you could possibly say. But secondly, would be I don't consider most angels to be much more powerful than those goetic spirits because of the rules they are applied to. Again,
There's
is
like
a
hall
tricky one to
monitors on
explain
steroids.
when you've got 8 minutes to try and explain a concept like that. In anyway, yes. So it comes down to the fact that one, they're into a system that allows them to be commanded. Should we say? Is that a safe thing for you to say? Um, so they're of a
They're
set of spirits.
mechanisms, like Siri. You tell it what to do.
Yeah,
Normally, you have to have the iPhone unlocked, right? Otherwise, then sometimes you don't always do, he or she, it doesn't always do what you tell it to do because you haven't got the password. You're not an
yeah.
administrator. But what was to happen? What could happen if you had that administrative password for the universe? That thing got to do what it's told, right? Right?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't realise you. I thought it was rhetorical. I didn't think you wanted a response.
Well, I think
The
this one's rhetorical. I think, although it has a question mark, because angels are foot soldiers. Yes, angels are like hall monitors on steroids. They have a job. They love to do nothing more than that job. So,
the interesting thing is lots of people think of the archangels as particularly powerful. However, in that system, they're pretty low on the rungs when you think about it as to what they're able to actually command. Anyway, it's also helpful that there is an unconsecrated statue of him in the room that I decided to bound him in. So, you know, it was more a case of, you know, how well he shouldn't have been where he shouldn't have been, is what I'm saying. So I had the righteousness of the fact that actually he wasn't supposed to be there.
would that
My
work on a
choice.
copper? Because I've seen these YouTube videos and that where someone's doing something naughty and the copper comes along, the police, they come along and you say, your services are not required. I have no need
Yeah,
of you. Away.
yeah.
But the copper just looks at him and says, do you want to be arrested, mate? How come that didn't happen to you, Chris? How come the Archangel Michael didn't turn around and say, Bitch, please.
Well, mainly because he walked into my space,
Ah,
which
I
is
see.
slightly different. So, but yes,
You're the
hence
king of
why
that castle,
this is not a good
and he's the
this is
dirty
not a good
rascal. Is that what
discussion.
you're saying?
This is not a good discussion for Witchcraft Live because it requires far too much explanation.
Should we do something on the Patreon?
What, you want me to talk more shit about angels? I thought we already did that one.
We did in Angels, really working with angels. I think the No Holds Barred Witchcraft podcast. We did a podcast on it, but I think the witches are really wanting now how to bind an archangel. Did you have him on like a rotisserie chicken? Did you have him going around? Was he hogtied?
No, he was hogtied,
No.
but he wasn't on a turning. This is
Brilliant
not.
discussion for the Patreon. I think maybe we should do a little special on advanced binding or something. Yeah.
I think we should. It's one of those things that the background for how you do this, I take for granted. But it is one of
Another one.
those
More
things.
people want it on the Patreon.
Of
Chris,
course they
you've
do.
started
Why do
something
you do
now.
this to me? You've started this.
I just give the people what they want to know. They want to know about a binding and gagging Archangel Michael. Now, when you had him hogtied, right, Archangel Michael, when you had him
Go
a
on.
bound and hogtied in the cupboard, did you take advantage?
I did not take advantage of him.
Okay.
No, I'm not that person. Anyway,
You're not that person.
I'm not that person. No.
Angels don't do it for you now.
There were other versions of me that probably would have loved that, but not this one. So,
Okay. So we got like 4 minutes left. So I think we should probably leave with this when it comes to spirits. So when it comes to spirits perhaps trying to manifest here in the physical world, they normally basically have to play by the rules of this physical universe. And when you've got spirits that they don't have a physical existence and they struggle with understanding physicality, three-dimensional living, then they're going to really struggle when they manifest here. So it's very easy if you design a vessel that's perfect for that spirit. If you design it for that spirit and it tries to manifest, what's going to happen is that much like a powerful vacuum cleaner, I'm thinking like one of those super Dyson ones, not one of the shitty ones you get from Tesco. It'll be sucked into that thing. So there are sometimes, because I know there's a couple of you, one or two, that might be interested in the gargoyles at the moment, yeah? So when it comes to gargoyles and stuff, there's a couple of ways in which they can actually work, and they don't necessarily you don't have to use the same principle for all of them. One principle is to create an egregore, to create a spirit that lives in the gargoyle. It is a spirit. It is essentially your bitch. You tell it what to do. Yeah, like your PA/guard dog. Yeah, gargoyle, egregore, protector spirit. Another thing you could do would be you could make a vessel that essentially traps spirits in. So if you have some types of spirits that try to manifest in places that don't have physical bodies, and we're talking low level entities, so we're not talking about something more powerful, but they're not familiar with and not used to and have no real familiarity with the laws of the universe that we're currently in. So when you've got something that's playing by your rules, by playing your game on home ground, the physical world, and it's trying to affect the physical world, a lot of the low level ones can really struggle. They don't really understand the rules. They can't quite. It's like me when I did like Texas Hold'em for the first time. I mean, I won it. I didn't have a fucking clue how I won it because I don't understand any of the rules. But I got lucky and I won it, right? The third thing, of course, with the gargoyles is the fact that you're taking something that is essentially here, there, and everywhere. You're talking kind of fourth dimension or higher, probably fourth dimension if we're talking low level, right? And then you're trying to, it's coming into a three-dimensional thing. So a lot of the times, a lot of these protection things will often work whereby as it starts to manifest in the physical world, it sees this weird physical thing, gargoyle, it's physical, and it's like, WTF, mate, what the fuck is that? And it's like, oof, don't like that. Imagine being a peeping Tom and peeping through a curtain and you see some ugly old lady the other side. You'd be thinking, fucking, I ain't looking through there again. So there's a lot of these things, a lot of things can manifest like that. But I think I went off on a tangent then. So what are we finishing on,
You
Chris?
did, but it wasn't awful.
It's
So
not as bad as it usually is.
it wasn't that far away. So the part is, which kind of answers a little bit better than I would have for the hog tying, which is home court advantage is number one. And two is, what are you wanting to do once it's bound, is what kind of says why you would be binding them in the first place.
I want to put
So
it on a leash and walk it down the road.
if
Like
you're expecting yes, but are you expecting it to still bark like a dog and rip somebody apart if you needed them to? Because that's the part. If you just want a show pony where it just, looks good in the space that it's in, then it doesn't matter that it has none of its actual power while it is there. The question is when you're getting to the points where you're binding a spirit that you want to use. So this is where a lot of the kind of ceremonial magician stuff happens, where they're actually wanting to not only bind it in a space, obviously not normally for very long, but they're wanting to bind it in a space and it still have access to its other dimensional owning. So, when you're pulling something into a three-dimensional space, are you wanting it to have its other energies, its other capabilities? Because in a 3D body, if you're putting it in a gargoyle, you are limiting its power. So it can be scary, it can bark, it can be very deterring for people. If that's all you need it to do, that's fine. You're putting it in a three-dimensional body and you're forcing it into a body where its presence is known, but it's not capable of doing anything. So, where this is a problem people have with gargoyles, which is they are much more, what they don't understand about them is the fact that you are restricting its power. So my egregore can do a hell of a lot more trouble without fixing it to a physical body. So whereas actually your egregore on its own could be there, you just wouldn't have anything scary looking for it to project from. So the question is whether or not it requires a physical body, in which case with the gargoyle, where actually scaring off negative energy is what it's designed to do in that position. Whereas actually, if I wanted to tie Michael, Michael down and use him, and I don't mean what Liam already hinted to before, if we're talking about actually using his power while he was here, that would be different. So what I did the other day would have been useless for that. So, me hog tying him literally just bound him there, not able to go anywhere else. He's not got access to his power. He's also got known for me.
So let's give this a couple of examples before we finish up. So one is that if you're tying it to a physical, say we're sticking something in a gargoyle, what you're essentially doing, what you could use that sort of magic for, is you could be saying, you no longer have the power to affect this physical universe. Anytime you come near this physical universe, the only way you're going to interact with it is through this gargoyle, i.e., much like the vacuum cleaner, you've got a bit of dirt. As soon as you get that vacuum cleaner near the dirt, it gets sucked up inside the chamber and is stuck. So you basically could be seen as a warning, could be seen as a, look, mate, come anywhere near this house, this place, even the physical universe itself, but just say you wanted to do it in your building, your house, saying, look, you come anywhere near this, you're immediately getting sucked into this three-dimensional little gargoyle that looks quite cute, but at the same time, it's out the front garden, and every time a dog comes past, the neighbour's dog cocks its leg and pisses on you. So if you don't want to get pissed on by the neighbour's dog, I suggest Spirit you stay away from my house type thing. Of course, another one, which shows my sick nature, is that you're talking, okay, you've been invited to a Wiccan circle, okay, and you want to show off a bit because the Wiccans is annoying. And the Wiccans, they ain't the most powerful witches. So what they do is they like to cast the magic circles and call in someone to protect them, yeah? And they call in the Archangel Michael because he's the biggest, baddest thing they're aware of. So you get invited to the little ritual, and then they call on the Michael, and he comes in, storming about, like he does, all beefed up like in his armor, and then all of a sudden he gets down on all fours, and it goes up to you, and he looks up at you, and you say, "Heel boy," and he sits next to you on the floor, going around like that. The reason you've done that is to show the Wiccans a lesson. What you've done is you've essentially said, this big bad spirit that is sent to protect you and that you're using to protect yourself, that spirit's my bitch. That's what we call in magic showing off. And if you want to learn how to do that, Chris is going to teach you how to do that on the Thoth Witchcraft Patreon. So at some point we'll do a video all about making angels and archangels your bitch. Does that sound good, everyone?
Why do you set me up like this time and time
Well, I'll
again?
help. I don't
Okay,
mind a little
that's
bit
fine.
of, I quite like that sort of a thing. It's fun. Although don't do it too often because the angels, much like those, when you pick up rocks and you see those little wood lices things and they run away. If you do that too many times to too many angels, as soon as you're in the room, the angels, they run away because they're a bit scared that you're going to put them in somewhere, like a statue. Especially one of those cheap Nemesis Now statues, like what we sell on the Thoth Witchcraft website, thothwitchcraft.com. So is that about it for today? Is there any last questions? I don't know. I'll have to see.
I don't think so. I think they were too busy being entertained by you setting me up again.
He sets you up because it's entertainment. I tell you what, it is very entertaining. I find it entertaining. And I don't like how you say sets him up because at the end of the day, I was just asking honest questions. So a lot of the time is what you patrons and what you people out there, that's the questions you want to ask,
Yeah. But I like to give information that people can understand.
Making the
Whereas you
Archangel
just
Michael your bitch is something everyone can understand. I mean, the bitch is useful. It has its uses.
He does occasionally.
But there we go.
Right. That's
You can
good. We
feed
don't
him
because
to your
we've got
pet
an appointment.
leviathans.
Come on, we've got an appointment.
Oh, right. Okay. So I think that's it. So thank you for listening. Obviously, this is the Ask a Witch Q&A. The topic today was a binding. Next month's topic, I think we're going to introduce the next Witch Wars, I think. So the next Witch Wars is coming. Witch Wars 2. And if you don't know what Witch Wars is, have you been living under a rock or something? Clearly you're not part of the Witchcraft Live Facebook group. Because if you would, you'd understand what the Witch Wars competitions is all about. So, you need to join the Witchcraft Live Facebook group. Because we get you witches and we pit you against each other, different teams and that, and winners win prizes and that. And yes, those prizes from the first round of Witch Wars, Witch Wars 1, is coming out to you very soon. Very cool they are as well.
Good.
So, thanks everyone. That's it. And we will see you for the next Witchcraft Ask a Witch Q&A on the first Sunday next month. So, bye.